Welcome to the Orthogonal Bet, where we explore the weird and wonderful ideas that shape our world. It's a cabinet of curiosities for the ears and the mind. I'm your host, Samuel Arbesman, complexity scientist, author, and scientist in residence at Lux Capital. In this episode, I had the pleasure to speak with Julian Gough. Julian is a writer, musician, and now researcher in cosmology. Julian was part of Toasted Heretic, an Irish rock group, has written novels for both children and adults, and even composed Minecraft's end poem. And as if those fascinating accomplishments were not enough, Julian has most recently been exploring the field of cosmology, specifically examining ideas at the intersection of evolution and universe formation to better understand how the cosmos is the way it is. He has been writing about this work in his newsletter called The Egg and the Rock. As he describes his work there, quote, "The Egg and the Rock makes a big specific argument, backed up by a lot of recent data across many fields, that our universe appears to be the result of an evolutionary process at the level of universes," end quote. This is some wild and heady stuff. Julian and I chatted about his career in music and writing, and how he slowly got interested in the big ideas and questions in cosmology. We explore the concept of cosmological natural selection, the universe's developmental process, Julian's blowtorch theory, and what it's like to do research well outside the scientific establishment. There are implications here for our understanding of the cosmos, the role of intelligent life in the universe, how to think about paradigm shifts in science, and the nature of interdisciplinary thinking. This was a wild ride, and I had so much fun talking with Julian. Let's jump in. Julian, welcome to the Orthogonal Bet. Great to be chatting with you.
Sam, wonderful to be here. The first time we talked, I didn't think we could not see into the glorious future.
Yeah, this is exciting. There's a lot of different directions I want to go in and talk about, but sure. Maybe the best way to start would just be you've had this sort of meandering and delightful career. If you could maybe just give sort of a capsule summary or overview of kind of what you've done, and then how that led or caused you to almost at this point end up in thinking about cosmology.
Yeah. Career is it's very kind of you to call it a career, Sam. It careers in the sense of a wagon out of control going down a hill. No, I've basically pursued my obsessions my whole life. So if you pursue your obsessions, you end up going on a very interesting journey, and eventually, if your obsessions are of vague interest to the rest of humanity, you actually end up somewhere interesting. So I think that's what happened to me.
And so, what have these obsessions been?
Well, I'm basically not properly socialized. I was kind of raised by wolves, so I just did whatever I wanted. So when I was a teenager, I decided I wanted to be a pop star in my 20s and a novelist in my 30s. And then I was thinking maybe a filmmaker in my 40s. I wasn't sure that was very far ahead. So I kind of set out to do those things. So I was in a pop band in my 20s because I didn't know anything. My dad was a fireman. My mother was a nurse. I was the first in my family to go to university ever. So you're just encountering all these new worlds with no prep. So it took me a long time to grow up. So I thought being in a pop band was the ideal place to spend a decade when you just hadn't grown up and didn't really know how to grow up. So I was in a band called Toasted Heretic for a few years with my friends. We brought out 4 albums and played in various parts of the world. And I would highly recommend it if you're an immature young man. It's a really way to spend your 20s. Yeah, we had a hit single in Ireland and had a very interesting time. And I learned to write in the way that is probably, I think, very useful for someone who's totally chaotic. I have a very chaotic personality because you just have to write these little 3-minute bursts, and I could hold my attention on 3 minutes at a time. Yeah. And then that's preparation then for longer work.
Yeah. So I was going to say, so you did the band in the 20s, and then you've also written books too. And so was this kind of very clearly the plan? Like, I did the 20s thing. Now I'm ready for the longer form writing and kind of writing novels.
Pretty much. Yeah. I learned to write at a sort of sentence level in songwriting, and then I moved on to novels. And I wrote a practice novel between the second and third Heretic album, I think, and then another practice novel between the third and fourth Heretic album. And the second practice novel ended up selling a few years later. So I suddenly had a career as a novelist, but I was still kind of feral. But writing novels was part of the growing up process. I wrote the novels in order to help myself grow up. Like the first novel I got published was really, I had that real breakthrough that some young men eventually reach and some never do, which is that other people are real and have feelings, and you should maybe care about that. So I'd fallen in love and it hadn't worked out, and then I wanted to understand that and also the person I fell in love with and all that. So I wrote my first novel, Juno and Juliet, was about trying to understand that other people are real and their feelings matter and that. So, and then I wrote some very weird novels after that were just for me working out my issues with society in Ireland. And Ireland was going through tremendous changes at the time. And it was a very invigorating, actually. It's an invigorating place to be because you were sort of going from the Middle Ages to the 21st century in one go. My parents have grew up with no electricity. They
Wow.
remember electricity arriving in rural Ireland in the 1950s, and then they ended up in this space age future. All of the modernizing of Ireland pretty much happened in my lifetime, and that was an exciting and interesting thing to try and write novels about, to try and understand. Yeah, and I think actually that was the seeds of a lot of my future interests came from that, because Ireland had this. There was stuff that was really wrong with Irish society, and Irish society wasn't sure how to admit that or move on from that, and it did in my lifetime. But when I arrived in Ireland, it was still very trapped in a social paradigm that wasn't working for a huge number of people, and they didn't know how to get out of it. They were stuck in this sort of 19th century vision of an Ireland of maidens dancing at the crossroads and happy housewives and nobody who stood out in any way from this kind of very narrow version of Irishness. And I did stand out a little bit from it, so I wanted to expand the definition of Irishness. But I was also very interested in how can a whole society go off track, and how do you get them back on track? And I think that's been very useful when dealing with cosmology.
Okay, so you'd been doing music, then you wrote books. How did you get interested in cosmology? Was there kind of a single moment? Was it just you were interested in various aspects of astronomy and science, and then you kind of noticed some things that seemed off? Or was it a specific moment that kind of captured your imagination?
Yeah. It'd be lovely if I had a very, very exciting story here. But it's kind of like, I've always been interested in the universe. I've always been interested in cosmology. I've always been interested in astronomy. I read a lot of science fiction as a kid. Once I read a lot of science fiction, I got very interested in the actual science and where are the gaps between the two. And as I got into science and cosmology and astronomy, I've been reading that all my life. And eventually you start to notice patterns. One thing a novelist is a pattern recognizer. A lot of what we do is pattern recognition. You're trying to pull big patterns out of very complex, messy data and then encode it in a story that, through a metaphor, addresses these big complex patterns. That's a lot of what you're doing. So, for instance, in like 2000, like the crash in 2008 or whatever, I predicted it in 2007 on my blog in reasonable detail, more than pretty much most of the economists at the time. Because I'm good at pattern recognition. I thought, oh, look, you've got these new products that are fantastically profitable and look like there's no risk. But as they expand through the whole territory of the subprime mortgage market, the securities, the way they were securitizing those and slicing them, I thought that as I can see what's happening here. I've seen this happen in history 5 or 10 times. This is exactly the same thing that happens every time. This is really safe at the beginning and it's going to be really dangerous at the end. And this is really a good idea at the start and it's going to be a catastrophic idea when it gets too big. And this is a new in the financial world, this was a new kind of virus to which we had no antibodies. And we were going to get antibodies, but only by getting the disease first. And you could just see that this was going to fall apart, So and again, this ties in with, I'm very interested in entire systems, entire societies or entire fields going wrong and the incentive structure to not see that you've gone wrong. It really intrigues me. So I'd seen that in, coming up to 2008. And I think I started to see it in cosmology. I was like, oh, all of their mistakes are leaning in the same direction. That's very interesting, And
so what were the mistakes? Yeah, what were the mistakes that you began to notice?
Well, if you look at the history of cosmology, it's always bigger than they thought, right? The universe.
Yeah.
It's always more complicated than they thought. It's always got more orderly structure at all scales than they thought. It's always got surprisingly they have the model. Cosmology has always had a model that assumed that this universe is a one-shot universe. That's where matter is. There's this random matter in it with arbitrary characteristics, and it's blindly obeying arbitrary laws. And that's the fundamental assumption underlying cosmology. So as they went back, looking further and further back in time, as our telescopes were better and better able to see further and further out, which means as you look out in distance, you're looking out in time, back in time, because the light takes time to get here. They were constantly expecting to eventually find randomness, and they were constantly finding structure and order. And I thought, this has been going on for a long time now. I don't think they're ever going to find randomness. And I started to think a lot about the universe. I started to think it's a membrane-bound system. It has a start point, and in that start point, at the Big Bang, you've got utter simplicity. In a reasonably short amount of time, I know it's 13.8 billion years, but that's not actually that long. It builds out these complex structures, galaxies and stars, and the stars go in multiple generations of stars. Stars explode, redistribute material with elements that they've fused in the cores of the stars, which then condenses to form the next generation of stars, which then run through their life cycle, fuse more elements.
Is our star is second generation or
third or fourth?
Oh, third generation. Okay, wow. Okay.
Third or fourth. Yeah.
We feel
so it's
young.
made out of material that was already in two previous stars, at least.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay.
Which is really, interesting.
Yeah.
And it's only really at that point that you can get planets because the suite of elements, the whole periodic table has to be built. Yes. And it's built in 3 rounds of star formation, 3 or 4 rounds of star formation, and then distributed. And then you get to planets. Then you can have biological life and so forth. And it's actually, it looks like a system. It looks like a metabolic system, that basically generates complexity as fast as it realistically can, When you look, the matter that forms the Earth, and it's not just the biological life is complex, the geological life gets more complex. And there's a chemical logic to it that just plays out. And I thought, this looks like a developmental process. This doesn't look like a random process. You can see it's random in the sense that, yes, it is just matter bumping into itself. But why, when the matter bumps into itself, does it generate such self-complexifying, self-ordering, highly orderly structures? It's not obvious why that should be,
Yeah. So you noticed this, what was kind of the next step?
I also noticed it wasn't really being addressed. It was like, this is just the universe happens to be like this. So I was like, what explanations have they got for this? And they're like, they've got these very, very thin multiverse theories that maybe there's an infinite number of universes that are, the Everettian version, like maybe there's every time a wave function collapses, there's a new universe, and in both directions, all the versions that could collapse, and the universe splits each time, and there's an infinite number of universes, and we happen to be in a complicated one because some of them happen to be complicated. But you've just filled the entire possibility space with universes. Okay, fine, but it doesn't. It's okay, but it's not. It doesn't make our kind of complicated universe more likely. It's just by throwing an infinite number of universes at it, you can get one unlikely one, or you can get a few. You can get a lot of unlikely ones. And then the sort of string theory model has 10 to the 500 versions of universes, and one of those is bound to be complicated. And use the anthropic principle then to explain why. Well, we could only notice it was complicated,
right? Because we're in that
generates complicated things. Yeah, but that's the equivalent of the rugby drinking song. We're here because we're here because we're here because we're here. It's not a good explanation. You've just thrown an infinite number of monkeys at the typewriter. And it just felt that's not a satisfactory answer to this because it looks so directional. It's so step by step, self-assembling, self-complexifying. And I thought the thing that looks like is an evolved organism, because self-complexifying, self-organizing systems, we know them. They're animals, trees, they're self-organizing, self-complexifying systems. And what's the explanation for that? The explanation is they have a long evolutionary history. So when you just look at one animal or one tree, you're not really looking at one animal or one tree. You're looking at the end point of a long evolutionary line that self-complexified and self-organized its way up to the complexity of that tree or that. And it felt to me that the container for trees and animals had the same characteristics as a tree or an animal. It felt like it had evolved. And then and only at that point did I Google, has anyone got a theory about, universes evolving? Because it seems to me that that's the obvious explanation, And it turned out that Lee Smolin had this idea, the theoretical physicist Lee Smolin had this idea about 30 years ago. And he'd written a paper, Did the Universe Evolve? And he'd written a book about it, The Life of the Cosmos, in 1995. And I was a bit heartbroken. It has been thought up before. And I'm sure it's probably then been dismissed for some reason because this idea is 30 years old. And I dug into it and I read stuff and I read the responses to it. And as I read them, I realized, oh my God, this idea has never been properly explored. And it's not for scientific reasons. It's for purely sociological reasons.
Oh, interesting.
The idea of an evolved universe, it was put forward by Lee Smolin, who's a great theoretical physicist, but his field is quantum gravity. This was a side project because he started reading some evolutionary stuff and thought, this is really interesting. And he was able to improve on John Wheeler's original ideas. I can go into that in detail in a minute. But We're just getting to how I got into this.
Yeah, no, this is good.
I will actually give you the theory at some point. But I realized he published the first paper before the internet, so it's very hard to access this, in the Journal of Classical and Quantum Gravity, which is fabulous journal, but can you imagine what the readership of the Journal of Classical and Quantum Gravity is in 1995, pre-internet? It's like maybe 150 copies in 150 libraries and not on the most popular shelves, So how would you even know that existed, And then it's an evolutionary theory. Evolutionary biologists need to know about this theory in order to actually develop it. And they didn't even hear about it. I had lunch with Dennis Noble, the great evolutionary biologist Dennis Noble, last month, and he had never heard of this theory. He'd never heard of cosmological natural selection. He'd never heard of the idea that the universe might have evolved. He should have been thinking about this for the last 30 years.
My original training was actually it was computational biology, but specializing in evolutionary biology. And This was not discussed at all or anything like that.
No, isn't that shocking? Yeah. But it's completely understandable because the boundaries for the sciences are in the wrong place. Anyone studying cosmology thinks this is an evolutionary theory. I'll leave it to some evolutionary guys. And the evolutionary biologists literally don't know it exists. They still don't know it exists.
Well, not only that, I can't imagine any evolutionary biologists even feeling comfortable attacking the topic just because it feels so different. Yeah.
Understandable. Totally understandable. Basically, nobody felt qualified to deal with this. It was if you're an evolutionary biologist, you think, I don't even know how a star works. I mean, maybe they do. Maybe they've read a bit on it. But cosmology, astrophysics, astronomy, they're really, really rich, complex subjects with extremely long histories, colossal databases, unbelievably difficult to just bring yourself up to speed on cosmology, astrophysics, and astronomy from a standing start when your background's in biology. It's just a very difficult task. And likewise with the cosmologists, you've studied evolutionary biology. There's so much there. It's such a rich subject. And if you're a cosmologist and you're desperately trying to keep up with the papers in your own field, you are not going to spend 3 years reading deeply into a completely alien literature in the hope that this fringe idea might be worth playing with, right? So nobody felt qualified to deal with it. I just got the realization, I think it was actually, holy crap, if nobody is working on this. Very occasionally you get a paper, but the papers were coming from philosophy of science. They were coming from evolutionary psychology. They were coming from mathematics. They were coming from a tiny number of people were fascinated by this idea and were writing one paper in their spare time and then didn't know where to put it. And it would come out in some completely irrelevant journal that was the correct journal for their field. It was the one where they knew the editor. But nothing ever connected to anything. And so there'd been no development on this. There'd been a certain amount of development. I want to give credit to people like Clement Vidal and John Smart, Louis Crane and University of Kansas, Michael Price. There was a few people who wrote 1 or 2 papers, and those papers were really good because they actually brought intelligent life into the framework of the theory and why we might develop intelligent life in a universe. How would that benefit the reproductive success of the universe? But that was it. There was a handful of papers. You could read the entire literature over a weekend. And so I thought, well, what a fantastic opportunity. Not even an opportunity. It was like, I'm obsessed with this. I love this. This is the most interesting thing I've been thinking about for the last few years. I could just keep thinking about this. And I don't have any competition.
There's no competition, right? It's you.
There's no competition. It's just me. And because I've sort of structured the kind of life I have where I just pursue my obsessions and keep my overheads really, really low, and I could just do it. And I eventually, I got to the point where I thought, I think this actually has massive explanatory power and predictive power. So when the James Webb Space Telescope came along, or was about to come along, I realized I had this fantastic opportunity to sit down and really think through this theory, the idea that the universe might have evolved from first principles, and see if it predicted anything about the early universe that wasn't predicted by the mainstream theories and that the James Webb might see. So I did that. And then I realized there were strong implications of that theory that nobody had laid out. And I put them up on a Substack. And I said, this is what the theory says we should see when the James Webb comes up. And if I'm wrong, I've just made an idiot of myself. But if I'm right, this is really, really interesting. And then the James Webb came online and it saw exactly what the theory predicted. So from that point, I really, really wanted to spend all my time on it. And then I started to get some support for it, and I started to get a couple of little grants for it, and people who were interested in unlikely, really interesting ideas started to help fund it. And and that's what I've been doing for the last few years now. 2 or 3 years. Yeah, and
That's
that
amazing.
starting to actually leak out into the wider world at this point. Yeah.
No, that's fantastic. I want to talk about the sociological features and like you kind of coming from the outside and think about that. But before that, maybe it would be a good time to kind of lay out the theory of this natural selection process and the specific details of your theory as well.
Yeah. Okay. So if I give you the history of the theory, it'll kind of fill in. And,
that would be great.
The history kind of is relevant because the sociology is a big part of it, and the history.
Okay. Yeah.
Incorporates the sociology because you cannot understand how an idea this big has been missed this badly unless you understand the sociology of the science.
Okay. Yeah, this is great.
Right. So John Wheeler, brilliant American physicist, John Wheeler, had an idea 50 years ago, whatever, that solved two problems in cosmology, which was, one is black holes. We had these black holes where mass energy, from a collapsing star, at the time that was the only model they knew of, but the collapsing star at the end of its life undergoes gravitational collapse once the radiation stops balancing the pressure because it's run out of fuel, collapses, and it collapses. If it's big enough, if it's more than a couple of times the mass of our sun, it keeps on collapsing. There's no end to its collapsing, and it collapses to a singularity. Now, what happens at the singularity is way up for debate because what really happens there is all our theories break down. We don't know what happens at the singularity. General relativity breaks down, quantum mechanics breaks down. But basically, everything just keeps collapsing to a point, and that's a black hole. And mass energy leaves our universe, and nothing comes back from it. Light can't come back, nothing can come back from that. It's left our universe. It's left our little bubble of space-time. Where'd it go? Where'd it go might not be the right question, but it's a weird mystery.
What happens next?
What happens next? Yeah, put it that way. What happens next? Right. And we have this other mystery. This is what John Wheeler realized. We've got this other mystery in our universe that involves a singularity. It's called the Big Bang. Mass energy appears from a point for no reason. We don't know where it comes from and expands like crazy and turns into our universe. And his idea was, they look like the same thing from different sides. What if a Big Bang in a child universe is in fact the other side of a black hole in a parent universe? Mass energy collapses to a point in the parent universe and bounces to form a new bubble of space-time outside the parent universe, right? It was an interesting idea. Hard to know what to do with it. It's speculative. Right. It's like, okay, that might be true. How do you prove it? I don't know. Jump into a black hole and report back. I can't report back I'm in a black hole. Okay. There's a lot of, you can see the obvious problems in testing that. But one of his students, well, maybe not student, but someone he sort of mentored a bit was Lee Smolin. And Lee was reading these evolutionary biology books by, Stephen Jay Gould and Lynn Margulis and people like that for fun, to take a break from the theoretical physics. And he realized that because Wheeler had said maybe the child universes are randomly different. That was an interesting idea. It's another multiverse that throws infinite numbers of random universes at the problem. Okay. But Smolin realized if the child universes vary slightly, not randomly, not hugely, but slightly if the child universes vary slightly from the parent universes, if there's just slight variation in the basic parameters of matter, with the mass of the electron or whatever, the strength of the strong nuclear force, whatever, you will get Darwinian evolution because the child universe is going to inherit from the parent universe with a slight variation. And that's kind of all you need then, because its child will reproduce by producing more black holes, and they will have the variation plus it's their own little slight variation. And you'll basically get Darwinian evolution of universes. And the ones that produce the variations that lead to more black hole production will be more reproductively successful. That universe will produce more offspring. So that basic set of parameters of matter will be more reproduced, and therefore you'll start to explore that end, the possibility space more. The branching tree, the evolutionary tree of universes will move towards runaway black hole production eventually. You should get a lot of black hole production because that's a lot of reproductive success.
And I just have one quick question about that.
Sure, yeah.
So related to that, like in biological evolution, and there's often kind of a competition for finite resources.
Yeah.
In this case, my sense is it's not quite that. It's much more around that there's just going to be a lot more of the ones that are reproducing more. Like if they generate more black holes, there's just going to be a lot more of them. So so just kind of relative percentages as opposed to finite resources that are being competed for. Okay.
Exactly. That's a great point. And that's a key difference because biological evolution, it's always happening inside a constrained environment with limited resources. So competition for those resources becomes a huge issue in how well you can reproduce and how successful you can be. A universe is both the organism and the environment. It's providing all the energy for its own lifetime, which is interestingly enough kind of would make sense because most of what the matter in our universe is doing is very efficiently producing energy. Like it's through fusion and through gravitational collapse, it generates enormous amounts of energy. The thing that makes that possible is that you can basically generate universes for free. You don't need the amount of parental matter isn't necessarily going to define the size of the child universe because universes net out to zero. We know our universe is essentially flat. The negative gravitational energy and the positive mass energy net out to zero. So you can basically, and we know from antiparticle production, you can just make stuff as long as it nets out to zero. You can generate universes. I mean, Hawking agreed with that. There's Lawrence Krauss has a book on it, A Universe from Nothing, or whatever. There's a lot of but that makes it possible for universes to be enormously reproductively successful. So you should get a lot of black holes in a successful universe, and our universe has a very high rate of. Relative to what, of course, yeah. But relative to nothing, relative to one, it's got a very high rate of black hole production. We've got 40 quintillion black holes in our universe already.
Okay.
They did a survey in 2022 at the University of Trieste or whatever. They worked it out. They've given the masses of the stars, given the lifespans and blah, blah, blah. We should have about 40 quintillion black holes already in this universe. That's a lot of reproductive success if black holes are the means of reproduction. So that was a really interesting idea. And he wrote his paper and he wrote the book. But when he wrote that book, we only knew of stellar collapse black holes. We only knew that stars at the end of their life collapse to form black holes. That was the only mechanism we knew of. Now, after that, a few people got very interested in this idea and played with it. And some of the guys I mentioned there, Clement Vidal, John Smart, Louis Crane, Michael Price, and they came up with a model. So Smolin had called that cosmological natural selection. They came up with a model, cosmological natural selection plus intelligence, because they tried to work out why would a universe generate intelligent life? Mm-hmm. And they realized, and this has been modified since and improved, I think, on over the years, but I'll give you the most up to the more version of it. The intelligent life forms, if you just think of them as matter that can manipulate matter, we know that this happens because we are technology wielding intelligent life. So this is not theoretical. It happens in our universe, and it happens under primitive conditions on a wet rock. So this is easily done, right? If you can get self-complexifying matter to evolve rapidly inside the lifetime of the universe so that it's manipulating technology, it's manipulating other matter, the life forms will optimize for energy production. All life forms try to use energy as efficiently and sustainably as they can because they don't want to die, right? The logical endpoint for that in our universe is the technological production of small black holes. The small black holes give you more energy back from matter than anything else. Fission is 0.1% efficient, like 0.1% of the mass will be turned into energy. Fusion is 0.7%, as maximum efficiency is 0.7% efficiency, or 0.7% of that matter will be turned into energy. But if you just throw any random, and it tends to be with fission and fusion, you've got to have certain kinds of elements that will do the job. With black holes, you just throw anything in there and you can get up to 42% of the mass back out as energy. Now, it's easy. Probably up to about 30-something% really. But the theoretical upper limit is 42%. You can get enormous amounts of energy back by just throwing stuff down the gravity well of a black hole. All the brightest things in our universe are basically things falling into black holes. Blazars, quasars, radio bright galaxies. They all turn out to be, that's just stuff falling into a black hole because that releases so much energy. So you can see how if life did evolve in a universe even once and to a level where it could make small technological black holes, you're generating far, far, far more black holes and therefore reproductive success, child universes, from a given amount of matter than you would be in a lifeless universe. So it would be highly conserved in the sense that it would be very successful. There would be the possibility space, that branch would get very fat and happy. There'd be a lot of universes produced along that branch. And the third breakthrough in the theory was my one, because that one again was speculative and it was set in the future. So again, it was very hard to test. We still had the problem that this theory could not be tested, right? We made a couple of small predictions, but they weren't enough. It wasn't solidly making predictions. When I thought through this from first principles, I had the advantage over Lee Smolin that there was a lot more data since then. He literally couldn't have come up with this idea because he didn't have the data. Since his time, we realized there are supermassive black holes in the center of every galaxy that we look at closely. And supermassive black holes are millions of times more massive than our sun. They're sometimes billions of times more massive. There's a range of sizes, but they're really, really big. There's a big gap between stellar mass black holes and supermassive black holes. They really are supermassive. And it had, when he wrote the book, we only knew of about 5 or 6 of them. Now we know there's one at the center of every galaxy. Those supermassive black holes, they were a problem for cosmology, astronomy, astrophysics, because like, how did you get, if black holes came from stars collapsing, how the hell did you get ones that were the mass of billions of stars? Like, that's a problem, right? And their model, because they assume everything's arbitrary and random at the start and builds up bottom up structure formation, they assumed, well, maybe lots and lots of stars become black holes and then they merge and then they merge and then they merge and then enough of them merge to make billions of them, right? Okay. If you have enough time, you can sort of make that happen. They were running out of time though at this point, because we've pushed our observations back. And now we were going to look into the first billion years with the James Webb Space Telescope. They didn't have much time for all this merging to happen. There was an alternative theory that Priya Natarajan, Avi Loeb, and Volker Braun, and a few other very good astronomers came up with about 18 years ago, I don't know, 20, which was that might be technically possible for supermassive black holes to form by direct collapse. And that means that if the gas is smooth enough, a huge territory of gas, like 1 million solar masses worth of gas, could collapse in one go. And if it's smooth enough, on the collapse down, it won't nucleate out into stars. It will just keep going and form by direct collapse. It'll just go straight into the black hole. It won't go through a star phase, right?
Interesting.
Very interesting. But they thought that was rare and unlikely and difficult to pull off, but there might be some of them, right? I did a first principles think through of the idea that universes reproduce through black holes, and realized that the earliest and most primitive universes along an evolutionary line, they had to reproduce and almost nothing else. Any complicated structures would have to have developed through evolution later. So all they're going to do is reproduce. And that means they're going to reproduce essentially by direct collapse. They're not going to build out complicated stars and then have, they're not going to build out galaxies. They're not going to build out life. It's just going to be a kind of imagine the minimal possible viable universe. It's just going to be a black hole, big bang, black hole, big bang, black hole, big bang, black hole, big bang. And that means the direct collapse of very primitive matter. And the earliest universes would not have produced 40 quintillion black holes. That's evolutionary success. Like, that's way down the line. They're going to produce a small number of really big black holes by direct collapse. They're going to produce direct collapse supermassive black holes. If we have direct collapse supermassive black holes in our universe, then the way they're formed is almost certainly going to be the way they were originally formed, by direct collapse. Because why would evolution invent a much more complicated roundabout way of doing something it was doing from day one, right? If you imagine those primitive universes that just form by direct collapse supermassive black holes and then big bangs, they're like prokaryotic bacteria, right? Prokaryotic bacteria I know biologists will jump on my back and say, prokaryotic bacteria are really complicated,
Right,
they have lots and lots of things going. It's true. Okay, go back to autocatalytic sets or something. Autocatalytic sets just autocatalyze and nothing else. They don't do anything complicated. Okay, reproduction has to start at the simplest point. So if we have a direct collapse supermassive, if we have a supermassive black hole at the center of every galaxy now, they will have formed by direct collapse.
And this also reminds me a little bit, and going back to evolution, it's a discredited idea within biological evolution, but the idea of like ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, that the evolutionary history is seen in the development. And you're saying that to a certain degree, we see that in our own universe in cosmology, that kind of the earlier, simpler things, which was kind of that's still within the evolutionary history of the universe.
Yeah. Well, the model I've developed, which is sort of 3-stage cosmological natural selection, they literally do recapitulate, because the later evolutionary breakthroughs are built on the back of the original evolutionary reproductive successes. So you have to conserve them because
you need each of those to get to the next thing.
You need each of them to happen to get to the next one. You do actually have the evolutionary history inside the universe. This is one of the reasons I love this version of the theory, the 3-stage version, because even though you've only got an n of 1, you can actually see the evolutionary history inside the n of 1, because so much of it is conserved, right? So the prediction I made was, if they form by direct collapse, they have to do it when the conditions are as similar to the earliest primitive universes as possible. It's going to happen before star formation. It's going to happen first. You're going to get a wave of direct collapse supermassive black hole formation in the smooth early gas. Now, a lovely part about this theory as well is the very smooth gas that is revealed by the cosmic microwave background radiation. We know it's incredibly smooth. There's slight density fluctuations in it, but they're like 1 part in 10,000 or something. They're very minor. It's really hard to have a theory of how stars form in that, because it's so smooth, it's really difficult to form stars. But there's a power law distribution of density fluctuations. There's a lot of small ones and a few medium ones and a tiny number of really, really big ones, these density fluctuations. That parallel distribution maps really cleanly onto the parallel distribution of the sizes of supermassive black holes. Yeah. So you've got you've got a large number of relatively small supermassive black holes.
Yeah.
And then and it goes right up to the billions, but there's very few that are actually massive, billions. But it's nice, huh? So if those density fluctuations are the seeds for the direct collapse supermassive black holes, they can collapse before there's any star formation. There's going to be no nucleation. You're going to get these really clean collapses. You can get them all happening in one go, and they have to happen in one go. They have to happen in a phase transition, because once you get a bunch of supermassive black holes, they start to really mess up the gas. It's not going to be smooth for much longer after that, because they start to pull in plasma, and the plasma forms an accretion disk, like a hot blazing donut around the supermassive black hole, and starts shooting out jets. We know this happens. This is what happens around supermassive black holes if they're in dense plasma, and the early universe is really, really, really dense. So the incredibly dense plasma in the early universe feeds the jets. The jets blast out into the plasma, and that forms the galaxy. The galaxies form around the supermassive black holes. The supermassive black holes come first. So what you should see is the further back you go, the bigger the supermassive black hole in relation to its galaxy.
Interesting.
Isn't that nice?
Yeah.
And that's why I predicted in advance. And what the James Webb sees when it looks back is the supermassive black holes get bigger and bigger the further back you go compared to the size of their galaxy. UHZ1, which is one of the galaxies they've seen well inside the first billion years, the mass of the central supermassive black hole it equals the mass of all the stars in the galaxy. It's 50% the mass of the galaxy, of the baryons in the galaxy.
So you've you started making these predictions, and blowtorch theory is kind of like the culmination of a lot of these kinds of things. And
blowtorch theory is more recently building out on that, because I realized that another implication of this, which is gorgeous, is if you go back to redshift 20, redshift 30, the gas, the plasma, is 10,000 times, 20, 30,000 times denser, depending on how far back you go, than it is today. Because once you compress by 20-fold in that direction, you're also compressing in the other three directions, and you end up with these colossally dense early universe plasmas. I mean, dense compared to the current incredibly diffuse plasma. They're not that thick, but they're pretty thick compared to that. And that can, if you're feeding jets that early with that amount of plasma, and those jets are going for decent lengths of time, they are going to drive huge cavities in that early plasma, right?
Yeah, interesting.
And they're going to do it early enough that the expansion of the universe later can expand those into the voids we see today. And the filaments that we see today in the model I'm exploring would be the paths of the jets themselves. The paths of the jets leave an electromagnetic pipe, basically, that can channel gas later on from the gas. A lot of gas gets pushed into these reservoirs, from these voids, and you've got basically a filament void structure organically built in the very early universe, if jets turn on early enough in sufficient numbers. And if you run the maths on it, the energy budget works. The energy budget works. If you have there's about 1 trillion galaxies. If you have very roughly 1 trillion supermassive black holes forming at redshift 30, 40, somewhere in that area, sometime inside the first 150, 180 million years, maybe first 100, maybe 80 million. I think 80 million is a kind of a sweet spot, 100 million. Anyway, the energy budget really works. That if the jets all turn on at that time, when it's that small, they blast cavities big enough to become the voids that you have today. And they have enough energy. They pump enough ergs into that plasma to do that. It's really, really interesting model. And it organically gives you voids and filaments without having to invoke dark matter. And it gives you galaxies really, really early. It gives you galaxies extremely early, which is what we're seeing.
Maybe I'm biased into sort of like the interdisciplinary kind of approach, but I love that sort of like combining of lots of different areas and novel theories. One of the things I wanted to ask you, though, is in terms of the reception and how it's kind of perceived. Like I can imagine people saying, "Oh, it's this musician and writer, and he's talking about cosmology now," and they kind of just dismiss it. I imagine there was some of that, but that being said, a lot of really sophisticated thinkers in this space are taking this kind of thing seriously. What was sort of the process? I imagine you actually were engaging with certain scientists. Yeah. What was that process to get to this moment where you're beginning to get funding and a very positive reception from scientists in these fields?
Well, it helps if you don't make catastrophic mistakes and aren't suffering from Dunning-Kruger, because So hopefully I don't seem to have, because like I haven't had anybody say, I've had people refuse to read it because like, why would I read it? It's by some guy who's not in the field. But I haven't had anyone read it and say, look at this blindingly obvious error, which renders it useless. So that's
great. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I came in from wildly outside it. So it was a long process of, I deliberately designed my life to live outside of society for a very long time. And then I suddenly found myself needing to get back into society because I thought, this is a great idea. Some scientists should be playing with this. It shouldn't just be my toy, And then I had to sort of contact people. It was a slow process. I emailed people like Tyler Cowen. Tyler Cowen runs this Emergent Ventures fund. And I thought, that's the kind of fund that should fund my kind of thing. And he turned me down. And then I sent him another application.
I was going to say, at what stage did he turn you down? Did he,
Sure.
When he looked at the application, did he then want to speak to you, or was it just kind of like right off the bat, like, no, this is not
the first time I applied, it was a no. The second time I applied, it was a no. Then I sent him my predictions, just as an email, separate thing. Because at this point, I sent him the predictions, said, just pay attention to these predictions because I'm going to get back to you again. And then the predictions started to get proved right. And I got back to him a third time. And the third time I got back to him, now the predictions were like paying off. And I had
interesting.
And then he got back to me and he said, thank you for your persistence. Let's talk tomorrow. And we had a very brief talk and he gave me some funding. It really, having made predictions has been crucial because
because otherwise it just sounds like, it's just like, right, here's a fun, crazy idea. Right. But saying, okay, no. Yeah. These are clear predictions. We want to see, I want to test them and actually see if there's something there.
They're testable. I mean, like blowtorch theory makes a bunch of solid predictions you can go and look for. Like I've talked to a couple of astronomers about looking for them. They're interested in this because, if filaments, if jets form voids and filaments, which then later with the expansion of the universe become the current ones, that explains their magnetic field. That their magnetic field comes from the jets. The jets are extremely magnetized plasma. So that explains why voids have faint magnetic fields, because it's very hard to explain why voids have faint magnetic fields otherwise. Currently, it's very difficult to explain. My model explains it. If the filaments are formed by the jets, they should have helical magnetic fields because jets have helical electromagnetic fields because they're coming out of a spinning black hole that torques the field lines as they go out. So you have a helical structure. So you should see helical electromagnetic field line. They should be essentially a bit more like electromagnetic pipes and a bit less like random matter that just was pulled together by gravity. And also you should see a more laminar flow of plasma through those filaments. It should be less turbulent than randomly than a random bunch of matter pulled together by gravity would be, because the helical field lines will guide the plasma and it's much less turbulent. So you should see that they should see relatively laminar. Everything's been distorted by the kinematics of the expansion of the universe over a long period of time, but you should get relatively laminar flow. And then as they come out the end of the filaments into the clusters, it should get more turbulent then. And there's faint evidence that might be true. It's just very hard. We don't have the resolution yet, but it's like, it looks like that might be the case, that you're getting the laminar flow, relatively laminar flow in the filaments, and then more turbulence when they come out the end into the clusters. So there's specific things you can look for. Also, if it's electromagnetically structured by the jets, you should have an electromagnetic boundary on the filament void boundary, which you'd have a more abrupt density transition from the void to the filament than you would in a purely gravitational model. So that's something you can look for. There should be a kind of a step change density drop into the void whereas it's much more blurred out in a purely gravitational model. So there's specific stuff you can look for. Yeah.
I guess maybe in terms of like a last question, what is the what are the next steps? You mentioned how you're kind of like moving back into like scientific society and kind of trying to is it waiting for these predictions to be tested? Is it collaboration? Is it working with other institutions? Maybe it's a little bit of all these things. What are the next steps here?
It's kind of all those things. I'm putting together an independent research fellowship to do this, and I want to actually move to the Bay Area because a lot of the evolutionary biologists I want to talk to are in the Bay Area.
Oh, interesting.
And also I want to be in the same time zone as some of the astronomers in further up the coast and that. And I want to build out a working group. I've just got made director of the Evolutionary Development Institute, Devo Institute, which is a voluntary association of scholars that are very interested in these ideas, in complexity and emergence and evolution and origins of life, and a lot of overlapping areas, but they're quite supportive of cosmological natural selection because some of the scholars, in it and running it have felt it was an underexplored area for years. So I'm going to put together probably a working group with them. I want more scientists to get in touch, and I'd love to collaborate with more scientists on this. It really should be proper domain experts working on it at this point. I've really had fun with this, but I want to hand over this wonderful little toy to other people to play with. Yeah. So I'm probably going to move to the Bay Area later this year.
But you've gotten positive reactions from many more kind of like traditional subject matter experts and scientists.
Yeah, it's been very gratifying. It's starting to escape containment. Some of the people that were interested at first were kind of just people who are interested in disruptive ideas. It's another reason I'm going to the Bay Area is there's a lot of people there who just like disruptive, innovative ideas that might be wrong, but if there's a 5% chance they're right, it's worth it because it's fun to discover new things that are true. But I've got some proper scientists are now they tend to look over their shoulder because they don't want to be seen with me, but they do want to talk to me. You know what it's like.
I love these interesting stories. Whether or not the theory is correct, and it sounds like if it's testable and actually things catch out, that'd be great. But we need people kind of coming something from outside, being a little bit more interdisciplinary, but also taking these things very, very seriously. Because there's a lot of dilettantes and things like that. And it sounds like you are trying to be very, very careful and not do that kind of thing. And
I am trying to be very, very careful. I'm sure I'm not careful enough, but I am trying to be very, very careful because I realize I will totally blow my credibility. If I do one dumb, really obvious mistake, that will get extrapolated across all my other stuff and used to dismiss it. So I have to be kind of pretty careful and self-critical before I publish anything. So that's why I'm not going to talk to you about this spiral galaxy formation model because I think it's really, really good. But if I've made a mistake, I will just bury it. It didn't happen. Yeah.
Well, this is great.
It's a really interesting tightrope to walk, but I really like it. It's fun, and I think this could be very liberating for a huge number of scientists inside cosmology and astrophysics and astronomy because I think they have an intuition that they have a feeling that they're stuck. They've been stuck for a long time. They've been modifying lambda cold dark matter for 50 years now, and maybe there is dark matter. Maybe there is, fine, but it clearly didn't predict what they see in the early universe. You clearly need something else. Maybe not a full replacement for it, but at least you need something else because they didn't predict the really compact, early, efficient galaxy formation that we're seeing. Their model is bottom up, slow mergers over time, and eventually structure emerges. That's not what you're seeing at all. And I think this gives them a way out. It's because one of the things that I like about this theory is it keeps everything. It doesn't build in new physics, new particles, new nothing. It takes all the data we've already got. It's very, very conservative. It's a very conservative theory. It's not adding anything absurd to the existing stacks of data, but it's extracting the meaning from the data. It's saying, look at the patterns here. You can see this is a way of describing all this data that makes much more sense. But all I'm doing is extracting the meaning from the data. And the fact that is able to make predictions about the early universe that are more accurate than the mainstream is very, very, very interesting. I actually do think I'm right. And I think it's not even that, it's not a negative for the field. It's a positive for the field. All of your beautiful, beautiful data makes even more sense than you thought. And you don't need a whole bunch of imaginary matter to make it work. You don't need a whole bunch. You've written in your book, you've written about simulations and modeling and the seductive, problems that can lead to. And I think there's been a real problem there because if you look at the big computer simulations of the universe, all of the ones that do the full modeling for the whole universe, they use dark matter and basically nothing else. Like maybe Flamingo uses some baryonic matter at large scales, but basically you've got models that do very small scale stuff that model baryonic matter, that model electromagnetism and so forth. But all the big scale stuff is still using dark matter and basically nothing else. And I think that is a catastrophe. I think it's a catastrophe. It can't model, and it's so insulting to baryonic matter. It's so insulting to say we can model the entire structural formation of the universe and not have an electron in there. No visible matter. It's all going to be done with dark matter. It's so insulting. The idea that we've fully explored the possibility space for baryonic matter, that we absolutely know how it will behave under all circumstances and don't need to think about that anymore, and all the problems will be solved with this imaginary particle. No, even if there is dark matter, using it as this universal solution to all your problems is a catastrophe because it stops you seeing what's there. It's so easy to just tweak the parameters in the lambda cold dark matter simulations.
Yeah.
You've got so many parameters. You've got 6 for the
Right, there's a certain like seductive power to just manipulating these things. Yeah.
You can manipulate, and you can, you've seen it with the theories of how spiral galaxies have spiral fields and that. Again, they're randomly built up from the original theory on that was the dynamo model. I'm not saying the dynamo model is wrong. I'm saying that it needs something else as well. The dynamo model said there's going to be almost no electromagnetic field, no spiral electromagnetic fields in early galaxies, and very slowly over millions of years it will build up. The dynamo will build it up over many rotations until from a tiny seed you'll end up with the current Gauss fields that you get in the current galaxies. And that was the theory. And as they went back, they kept finding the spiral magnetic fields. And as they went back, they kept finding the field strengths were at least as high as you have today in the Milky Way. They didn't get lower as you went back. And then they constantly had to modify the theory. This happens again and again. And as you get back into the first billion years, what you're finding is active structure formation, electromagnetically driven by jets and so forth. Stuff that's basically a lot of stuff that's just not modeled at all in the full scale simulators, and they can't solve it from inside their current paradigm, because the underlying assumption that this is a random arbitrary universe that very slowly randomly things bump into each other and accidentally build out something complicated by mistake isn't true. It's a highly evolved universe, and the evolution has fine-tuned the basic parameters of matter, which are exactly as we know them to be. We're not adding anything here. We're just saying that there is a meaning to the weird values of the basic parameters of matter. They're functional. They have consequences. And some of their consequences are very rapid early structure formation. And this is how it happens. And I can give you this is a model. And there may be a better model. Maybe someone will come up with a better one. But this is a working model that gives you voids and filaments. It gives you early compact galaxies. It gives you spiral fields. It gives you what you're seeing organically from the start, because an evolved universe builds out its body plan as early as it possibly can, because that's the most efficient time to do it. And evolution has done that with every other organism we've ever encountered. Every organism we've encountered builds out its body plan as at the earliest possible stage, and then that develops from there. And that's what our universe seems to be doing. And evolution seems to me to be the only sensible explanation for that.
That is probably the perfect place to end. Thank you so much. This is fantastic. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Really delight talking to you. I'm so pleased to be talking to you about this delightful subject.